It is Rome, 1944, and the city smells like a strange, suffocating mix of ancient stone, lemon blossoms, and the sharp, metallic tang of gunpowder. The Eternal City, once the heart of the world, is now a cage made of barbed wire and Nazi checkpoints. The sun is shining, hitting the golden domes of the cathedrals, but there is no warmth in the air. The streets are quiet, too quiet. It is a silence born of fear, a silence where every footstep feels like a heartbeat counting down to something terrible. But in the shadows of a small, cramped tailoring shop on a narrow side street, a young woman is working. Her name is Carla Capponi. To the German occupiers, she is just another invisible Italian girl, a seamstress with tired eyes and a needle that never stops moving. They see her sitting on park benches or leaning against crumbling walls, her hands busy with embroidery or repairing a torn hem. They see a girl who belongs in the kitchen or behind a sewing machine, a girl who couldn't possibly be a threat to the might of the Third Reich. But they don't see what she is actually doing. They don't see the specific way she is twisting a long, shimmering strand of red silk between her fingers. They don't see that this isn't just thread, it is a weapon. And as a high-ranking Nazi courier pedals his bicycle down a deserted alleyway, carrying top-secret orders that could change the course of the war in Italy, he has no idea that his life is about to be ended by the very thing that held his uniform together. If you believe that the most dangerous weapon in a war isn't always a tank or a bomb, but the person everyone chooses to ignore, type the word silk in the comments right now. And if you want the raw human truth of the resistance that the history books usually gloss over, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. To understand why a woman like Carla Capponi would pick up a silk thread and turn it into a tool of death, you have to understand what the Nazi occupation had done to the soul of Italy. By 1944, the Germans weren't just occupiers, they were predators. They had turned Rome into a fortress of paranoia. Every corner had a sniper, every cafe had an informant, and every night brought the sound of trucks taking men away to be shot in the Ardeatine caves. The Italian people were starving, their dignity stripped away, their city turned into a playground for the SS. But the Nazi high command made one fatal mistake. They completely underestimated the women. They called them the Staffette, the couriers. To the Germans, these women were just domestic servants or simple villagers. They were allowed to pass through checkpoints without being searched because the German officers, in their immense Prussian arrogance, believed that a woman was incapable of being a soldier. They thought war was a man's game, a science of steel and maps. They didn't realize that the Staffette were the literal nervous system of the Italian resistance. They carried grenades in baskets of eggs. They hid pistols in their hair, and sometimes, when the target was too high profile for a loud gunshot, they used the skills they had practiced since they were children. They used the thread. Carla Capponi wasn't born a killer. She was a daughter of Rome, a law student, a woman of culture and empathy. But when she saw the Nazis executing her neighbors and turning her streets into a slaughterhouse, something inside her snapped. She joined the GAP, the Gruppi di Azione Patriottica, the most elite and dangerous urban guerrilla group in Italy. According to her own later accounts and historical records of the Roman resistance, Carla was a master of the invisible strike. She knew that a pistol was loud and invited 100 German soldiers to come running. But a seamstress sitting on a bench near a Nazi command post? She was part of the landscape. She would sit there for hours, her hands moving with mechanical precision, sewing a dress or a coat. But her eyes were always moving. She was timing the couriers. She was learning the rhythm of the occupation. She knew exactly when the lone courier would pass through the dark stretch of the Via Rasella. She knew the exact moment when the wind would muffle the sound of a struggle. She wasn't just a girl with a needle. She was a predator who had learned to hunt in plain sight. If you respect the courage it takes to stand up to an empire with nothing but your bare hands and your wits, type the word justice in the comments right now. Let me know if you think these women were the true heroes of the Italian front. The mechanics of the silk thread assassination are as fascinating as they are terrifying. Silk is one of the strongest natural fibers on the planet. When it is woven into a specific type of cord, it is nearly impossible to break, and more importantly, it is silent. It doesn't click like a pistol hammer. It doesn't smell like cordite. A seamstress like Carla understood the physics of tension. She knew that if you loop a length of reinforced silk thread around a target's throat from behind, the thinner the thread, the more pressure it applies to the carotid artery. It's not about strength. It's about the clean, surgical application of force. Historical accounts of the Staffette describe how these women would use their sewing kits as deception kits. A spool of red silk looked innocent in a sewing basket, but in the hands of a woman who had lost her brother to a firing squad, it was a garrote. On that night in 1944, Carla wasn't acting out of a desire for glory. She was acting out of a mechanical necessity to stop the flow of information. As the German courier approached, his boots clicking rhythmically on the cobblestones, Carla stood up from her bench. She didn't look like an assassin. She looked like a girl who had dropped her thread. The courier, seeing a young, beautiful Italian woman, slowed down. He smiled. He thought this was a moment of officer-level gallantry. He leaned down to help her, and in that split second of German arrogance, Carla moved. The silence on that Roman street in that moment was absolute. There was no shout. There was no struggle that lasted more than a few seconds. The silk thread vanished into the high wool collar of the Nazi uniform, and the pressure was applied with a cold, focused fury that the German high command couldn't have modeled in a war game. Carla didn't look at his face. She didn't look at the medals on his chest. She looked at the bag he was carrying, the bag that held the orders for the next wave of executions in the city. She was a businesswoman of death, a phrase we often use for Patton, but applied here to a woman who had turned domesticity into a weapon. According to the memoirs of the Roman partisans, this was the moment the Nazis truly began to fear the shadows. They couldn't fight an army they couldn't see. They could handle tanks and artillery, but they couldn't handle a seamstress who could vanish into a crowd before the body was even cold. When the courier's body hit the stones, it didn't make a sound. Carla took the bag, tucked the spool of silk back into her apron, and walked away. She didn't run. Running invites a chase. She walked with the steady, calm pace of a woman who was going home to finish a dress. To the German generals sitting in the Grand Hotel in Rome, the Italian people were still just a mongrel horde. They genuinely believed that the Italians were too disorganized, too emotional, and too uncultured to mount a real resistance. They spent their evenings drinking fine wine and discussing the elegance of their defensive lines at Monte Cassino. But while they were talking about the art of war, women like Carla Capponi were practicing the reality of it. They were dismantling the occupation piece by piece, courier by courier, thread by thread. The Germans never understood the Italian soul. They didn't understand that for a Roman, the city isn't just a collection of buildings, it is a living thing. When the Nazis hurt the city fought back through its people. Carla wasn't an outlier. She was part of a massive, invisible web of women who had decided that the Prussian code meant nothing compared to the survival of their families. They were mothers, sisters, and daughters who had been forced to become ghosts. If you believe that a leader's real character or a soldier's real strength shows in how they protect their own home, type the word honor in the comments. Let me know if you think the Italian resistance is an underrated chapter of World War II. We have to understand what Carla had seen that fueled this kind of cold, surgical violence. In March 1944, the Nazis had carried out the Fosse Ardeatine massacre, executing 335 Italian civilians in retaliation for a partisan attack. Carla knew people who were on those trucks. She knew the families left behind. She had seen the culture that the German officers were so proud of, and she had seen it for what it truly was, a factory of murder disguised by polished boots and monocles. When she used that silk thread, she wasn't just killing a courier, She was performing an act of moral accounting. She was telling the occupiers that their rank, their uniforms, and their superiority were all myths. She was proving that a single Italian girl with a needle could bring the 1,000-year Reich to its knees in a dark alleyway. This is the part of the war the posters don't capture. It wasn't just about big battles and moving lines on a map. It was about the psychological dismantling of an ideology. It was about making the enemy realize that they weren't the masters of the world. They were just targets. Carla Capponi's diaries and the interviews she gave late in her life show a woman who carried the weight of her actions with a quiet, somber dignity. She didn't brag about the men she killed. She talked about the necessity of it. She wrote about the smell of the city after a raid, the way the light hit the Tiber River, and the particular kind of silence that follows a successful mission. She was a woman who could plan an assassination with the precision of an engineer, but she was also a woman who was haunted by the faces of the people she couldn't save. She wrote to her comrades constantly, not about military glory, but about the future of Italy. She wanted a country where a girl could sit on a park bench and sew a dress without having a weapon hidden in her basket. This is the true measure of a resistance fighter. They don't fight because they love the violence. They fight because they love what the violence is protecting. They fight so that the next generation doesn't have to. When Carla pulled that silk thread tight, she was saying something to the entire Nazi high command without ever speaking a word. She was telling them that their world of privilege and tyranny was over. She was telling them that the rules of the gentleman's war, where officers stayed clean while others died, were finished. She was taking years of hunger, fear, and grief and validating it in one silent, decisive moment. It was a moment of absolute moral clarity. If you believe that a true hero is defined by what they are willing to do when no one is watching, type the word Carla in the comments right now to honor her legacy. Think about the crossroads of that alleyway in Rome. Think about the sound of that courier's bicycle falling to the ground. That is the sound of the 20th century shifting. It is the end of the myth of the invincible occupier and the beginning of the reality of the people's power. Patton understood this in his bones when he stood at that limousine window, and Carla Capponi understood it in her bones as she sat on that park bench. They both knew that you don't defeat an enemy just by taking their land. You defeat them by breaking their spirit, by forcing the master race to realize that they could be ended by a silk thread. Carla was stripping away their last shred of pride. She was making them feel the mud of their own defeat. And there was a calculation underneath her actions, cold, clear, and correct. Liberation isn't just about moving borders. It's about what happens in the minds of the people when the fighting stops. If the Nazis had walked away from Italy believing they were still better than the Italians, the war wouldn't have truly ended. Carla made sure they knew exactly who had beaten them. She made sure they knew it was the seamstresses, the shopkeepers, and the mongrel horde they had despised. We still talk about Carla Capponi today because she wasn't a clean, simple character. She was a woman of iron will who had to do terrible things in a terrible time. She was the lioness of Rome, a woman who earned the gold medal of military valor, the highest honor in Italy, not because she led a charge with a flag, but because she had the guts to be the most dangerous person in the room while looking like the most innocent. She knew what the war was for. It was for the small things, the lemons, the domes of the churches, the right to walk a street without fear. The silk thread at the crossroads was a small moment in the grand scale of the war, but for the people of Rome, it was everything. It was proof that they were still alive. It was proof that they were still fighting. History isn't made by grand gestures in palaces. It's made on muddy roads and in dark alleys, in the rain and the dust, by people who refuse to blink. It lives in the diaries, the letters, and the first-hand accounts of women who remembered the feeling of silk between their fingers for the rest of their lives. These are the moments that define what an era actually believed about itself. The Nazis believed in the monocle and the tank. Carla Capponi believed in the needle and the soul. And that day in 1944, the needle won. The silk didn't care about anyone's medals, and neither did Carla. If this story of the invisible assassin touched you, if it made you think about the hidden power of the human spirit, hit subscribe, leave a like, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. We keep these stories alive because the truth is the only thing that actually lasts. Thank you for being a part of this journey into the raw heart of history. I'll see you in the next one.